For over 100 years, Rolls-Royce has been a British icon.
It's all about classic, timeless, exclusive, authentic.
Known for unparalleled luxury and classic design. Loved by royalty.
There is a cigarette burn which was allegedly done by Princess Margaret.
And the rich and famous.
John Lennon with his psychedelic car and his LSD.
This is the story of Britain's most iconic engineering firm.
Do you know what their order book is? £60 billion.
Where no request is left unanswered.
You know, tanning leather to the exact colour of somebody's nail varnish.
It's a firm that almost died.
We can remember sort of looking out the window and wondering what was going to happen next.
But whose engines saved the nation.
The war would have been lost right at the beginning were it not for the Spitfire, I have no doubt.
At the heart of it were two men with a vision.
There was a match made in absolute heaven. They made magic together.
To make one of the world's greatest brands.
It's a true motoring classic.
If you buy a new Rolls-Royce, the world's most luxurious vehicle, your journey will have begun long before your car is even built, at their Goodwood factory. This is where your dreams will be created. Michael is the bespoke designer at Rolls-Royce.
This is the bespoke atelier. This is where a customer's journey really starts for their bespoke Rolls-Royce.
No statement car will turn heads without a decent paint job.
These are some of our standard colours. We have around about 44,000 different shades available to any customer. Sometimes when there isn't a colour within that spectrum, we'll create a bespoke colour for the customer.
The staff here are used to unusual requests.
So we've had examples where a customer's matched to their favourite shade of lipstick. There has even been the instance where customers wanted to match their paint to their red setter dog.
And the extravagant choices extend to interiors too.
Behind me you see multiple different options of leather upholstery and fabric. So we traditionally work in natural grain leather, but we can also create interior trim in more exotic leathers.
Brian is the department manager of the leather workshop.
We've used crocodile, we've used alligator, they're very similar of course. We've also used ostrich hide, which is really full of character, where each and every of those large feathers go, you get a really nice detail on the skin. We've also used a little bit of stingray, we've used a little bit of shark skin, camel skins, we've looked at buffalo hides, we've looked at kangaroo hides and things like that.
And right from the early days, this attention to detail was key. Rolls-Royce started with two men, Charles Rolls and Henry Royce. They were unlikely business partners.
Rolls and Royce came from very different backgrounds. Royce had a very poor childhood, and his first job, in fact, was selling newspapers for W.H. Smith.
After just 1 year of formal schooling, the young Henry Royce was sent out to work to keep the family afloat.
Henry Royce didn't go to university, didn't come from a wealthy background, but luckily was born with an invented streak.
He became an electrical engineer in the slums of Manchester.
He first of all just had a workshop with a room above it, making small electrical components, lamp holders, bell sets, and things like that.
Then, in the 1890s, he saw his first motor cars and immediately began working on his own car, the Royce.
He realised that if he had an attention to detail in the engineering side, he would build a very, very special motor car.
He built prototype cars, which were absolutely excellent for their time. Royce insisted on doing everything in the best possible way. He'd use the best materials. He would not compromise on design or cost in any way.
His future business partner, the Honourable Charles Rolls, had a very different upbringing. He went to Eton and then Cambridge University.
Charles Rolls was, of course, an aristocrat.
He was a very flamboyant gentleman. He was a sporting gentleman, an aviator, a balloonist, a racer.
Rolls was a pioneer motorist and was selling cars in London. He had an agency for European cars. There wasn't a British-built car that came up to his own exacting standards.
Then Charles Rolls met Henry Royce.
A mutual friend of both Rolls and Royce persuaded Rolls to go to Manchester to see Henry Royce's car, and as soon as Rolls saw it, he realised it was infinitely better than anything he'd come across before, and they shook hands and agreed that C.S. Rolls and Company would sell all the cars that Royce Limited could make, and they'd call it Rolls-Royce.
It was the handshake that created a company that now spans the world. But these two friends would soon be parted.
Rolls was the first Englishman to die in an aviation accident.
Today, Rolls-Royce's cars are a byword for luxury. The jet engines power the greatest airliners. It all started with a working-class engineer, Henry Royce, and a flamboyant aristocrat, Charles Rolls.
They hit it off immediately.
It became clear fairly early on that this was something special.
Mr. Rolls was a pioneer. He brought marketing flair and pizzazz into engineering, which engineering is very functional, maybe a little bit dull, but he brought that flair into the company.
Royce was the developer of the fantastic engine. Rolls' job was to sell them.
You've got a showroom chap who loves his cars, meets an engineer who also loves his cars. And therein was a match made in absolute heaven. They made magic together.
They launched the 4050 car, later named the Silver Ghost. And in the space of just a couple of years, Rolls-Royce were winning prestigious awards. The Manchester workshops just couldn't produce cars quick enough. A brand new factory was needed.
They moved to Derby and built factories there to Royce's design, and this was opened in 1908.
And it was here, at the Derby factory, that Rolls-Royce produced cars that became the watchword for style and elegance.
The Rolls-Royces, they were so refined, they were hand-built. You can see instantly how much time and effort was made to construct this wonderful motor car.
But just as Rolls-Royce was taking off in Derby, Charles Rolls was taking off elsewhere.
Rolls was interested in flying, and flying, of course, was relatively new as well.
Henry Royce didn't share his friend's love of aviation.
It is said that Royce thought flying was impractical and dangerous and didn't like the idea of it at all.
But Rolls had the flying bug.
Rolls was a pioneer and he loved the latest thing. In 1903, or shortly afterwards, he met the Wright brothers. Flying became his thing.
Rolls thought flying was the future, but Royce didn't share his vision.
He wanted Royce to build an aircraft engine for him. Royce declined. He didn't think there would be much money in it.
Tragically, Rolls's passion for aviation led to his death, aged only 32. In 1910, he was performing in an air show in Bournemouth when the tail of his aircraft broke off, sending him plummeting to the ground.
The plane crashed and he died. He was the first person to die in an aircraft crash like that, and was a great loss to the company.
Despite Charles Rolls's untimely death, the company that bore his name continued to thrive. And soon it would create its greatest icon. An icon that sits on almost every Rolls-Royce.
The Spirit of Ecstasy encapsulates the prestige and beauty, and above that there's a sense of freedom to it as well.
But in the early days, there were some Rolls-Royce owners who didn't appreciate the refined quality of the brand.
Motorists could buy mascots of all sorts to fix on top of their radiator cap. Some of these were rather tasteless, caricatures of policemen and things like that. Very undignified on a Rolls-Royce.
Royce didn't think much of these creative additions to his classic design.
Henry Royce was very disappointed that some very gaudy mascots were being put on his motor cars.
He voiced his concerns to a friend and fellow car fanatic, Lord Montague of Beaulieu.
My grandfather, John Montague, was a great advocate of the development of the motor car. In 1902, he set up a magazine called The Car Illustrated. One of the people he employed in the magazine was an artist called Charles Sykes, who produced a lot of the illustrations. So my grandfather suggested that he might commission Charles Sykes, his house artist, to produce an official mascot for Rolls-Royce. And in fact, although Charles Sykes was working in the capacity of an illustrator, he was also a sculptor. In 1910, Charles Sykes started work on a mascot for Rolls-Royce, which, when unveiled in 1911, was what we now know to be the Spirit of Ecstasy.
But the identity of the Spirit of Ecstasy is a story in itself.
The very interesting story about this is that the lady who modelled for Charles Sykes was a lady called Eleanor Thornton. Now, Eleanor Thornton's day job was working for my grandfather as his personal assistant. What only became public knowledge many, many years later was that my grandfather and Eleanor Thornton were having an affair which ran for many years.
But the mystery deepened when Lord Montague asked Sykes to create a new one-off figurehead for his own Rolls-Royce. Again, Sykes used Eleanor Thornton as the model. And this one was known as the Whisperer.
So why is Eleanor, or the Whisperer, whispering? We can see that she has her finger to her lips. There are two possible reasons for this. One is that Rolls-Royce prided themselves in the quietness of their cars, and of course she's sort of symbolising, saying, oh, it's a lovely quiet car. But the other is that she holds a secret, and one must remember this was created as the personal mascot for my grandfather's car, and they had a secret, which was that Eleanor had born a child by him, and so that was their secret. There is no complete proof that Eleanor was the model for the mascots. It may be that Charles Sykes actually used influences from more than one model.
It's certainly true that the Spirit of Ecstasy bears a lot of characteristics of Eleanor.
One thing that's very telling is that shortly after the Spirit of Ecstasy was first unveiled, Eleanor's doctor, for some reason, had reason to see it and said, they shouldn't have put her face on the mascot. It's a giveaway. My grandfather cherished his original mascot and an early Spirit of Ecstasy mascot. And I think there was a reason for that. And that's not just because his friend Charles Sykes created them, but it was actually his mistress and his lover who was portrayed there.
Nowadays, the Spirit of Ecstasy adorns the front of every car.
And that badge is so important to Rolls-Royce. It is sacred. And one of the reasons it's sacred is because it's so evocative of the virtues of this prestigious brand.
It was a brilliant idea, as it turned out. If ever a product defined how Rolls-Royce was something special, it's that Spirit of Ecstasy, isn't it? and as soon as you saw it, you know, oh, that's a Rolls-Royce.
By 1914, the stratospheric growth of Rolls-Royce cars, now with their new mascot on the bonnet, was down to one model, the Silver Ghost.
We've got quite a lot of cars in stock, such as this Silver Ghost.
Charles Baisley is a former Rolls-Royce employee.
Next one. 6 turns.
And now runs a Rolls-Royce restoration company.
Well, we service, repair and sell Rolls-Royce and Bentley motor cars. I've done that ever since I was a lad, really. Ready? No.
Starting a car that's over 100 years old can be tricky.
You definitely needed a very strong chauffeur in those days. You couldn't use an old boy like me. Come on, my good man. I don't think you're turning it fast enough. Nearly.
For Charles, Rolls-Royce is in his blood.
My grandfather was a chauffeur for Sir Hubert Parsons. In 1914, the Parson family bought a Silver Ghost, which he was allocated as the driver.
Later that year, war broke out. Rolls-Royce cars were requisitioned by the government.
A lot of cars were converted into military vehicles, and Rolls-Royce was a typical car that the body was taken off and it was turned into an ambulance. Some were turned into tanks and armoured cars, these old ghosts with different bodies on them, suitable for war.
The war effort needed drivers, and not many people could drive at that time. So Charles's grandfather was sent to the Western Front with his Rolls-Royce.
In 1917, he was killed. He was blown up in an ambulance because he was a St John's ambulance driver. They went out and obviously done the work to get people away from the front and move them to safety.
The coming of war would change the fortune of Rolls-Royce forever. At the request of the government, Henry Royce was finally persuaded to design an aero engine.
Aviation became very important in the First World War. The engine that was being used in British aircraft was in fact made by Renault.
Royce, the perfectionist, wasn't happy with the French design.
Royce, as usual, thought that he could improve it.
So very quickly, in 1914, he decided to build his first aero engine, the famous Eagle.
What it led to in terms of Rolls-Royce being in the aero engine business was absolutely critical, of course.
By the end of World War I, over half of all aircraft used by the Allies were powered by Rolls-Royce engines. But the strain of World War I almost brought about a final casualty, Henry Royce himself. In failing health, Royce moved to West Wittering for some sea air.
Royce ran the company from away, which was quite a remarkable thing to do in those days.
Royce never went back to Derby. He died in West Wittering in 1933. And every year, Rolls-Royce enthusiasts and villagers hold a memorial service in West Wittering.
I'm very pleased to say that Jackie has done it again with the weather. Something about a direct line.
It was booked.
It was booked, yes.
Rolls-Royce cars have been built since...
Those who come feel that it is a life worth remembering.
Building a brand which simply speaks of quality.
I think that's a very important part of this.
The legacy Henry Royce created was based on the principles he adopted. He aimed for perfection and rarely fell short.
Mother and son, Jackie and Stephen, live in the barn that once served as Henry's workshop, situated next to his house.
We had no idea, did we, until we bought the house, that there was any history of Rolls-Royce. Just it was the Rolls-Royce Enthusiast Club magazine left on the table in the kitchen that made us aware there was any history of Rolls-Royce here at all.
When they moved in, Jackie and Stephen discovered echoes of Henry's life.
It's the bench here that we're stood in front of, where he actually undertook work for local people. This was such things as repairing lawnmowers, bicycles, because he was always a practical engineer.
And you'll see along here these ancient bit of leather, which is where, when he was working here, he used to keep his tools.
Many other manufacturers claim to be the best, but none have the popular and timeless perception for quality of Rolls-Royce.
I remember one day a car pulled up outside and quite an elderly gentleman got out and he said to me, "Can I have a look in your back garden?" And I said, "Well, yes, you can. Why?" And he said, "Well, I used to work here as a boy, and your back garden was his vegetable garden, and every single vegetable had to be in completely straight lines, and if they weren't, they'd have to be dug up and planted again, because this was the perfectionist that Henry Royce was."
May the genius and the quest for perfection which inspired Henry Royce also inspire us through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Shortly before he died in 1933, Henry Royce made one more contribution that was to change the nation's history. The story began as he was walking along the beach.
Royce had a team of engineers working with him in West Wittering. One day he was walking with one of them on the beach. They stopped and Royce drew out some sketches, some designs in the sand with his walking stick.
This engine became known as the R engine and propelled Britain to victory in the Schneider Trophy.
The Schneider Trophy really was very significant in that it formed the basis for the Merlin engine.
Rolls-Royce's Merlin engine powered 3 aircraft that helped win the war: the Hurricane, the Lancaster bomber, and the Spitfire. But the first generation of these legendary engines gave the Germans the upper hand.
When they were fighting, that sudden loss of power meant the enemy could get away. And they knew it.
Rolls-Royce is a name synonymous with ultimate luxury, producing state-of-the-art engines and top-of-the-range cars. But in 1939, times were very different. 6 years after Henry Royce died, the dark clouds of war descended and the lights went out all over Europe. That they shine again today has much to do with the engineering genius of Henry Royce and his Merlin engine, the power behind the Spitfire.
From a pilot's perspective, it is like having your own wings. It is the ultimate flying machine. You have an incredible amount of power for this fabulous Rolls-Royce Merlin engine.
Matt Jones is the owner of Boltby Flight Academy, where he teaches people to fly vintage aircraft like the Spitfire.
When you see the clouds and you see the blue skies and you've got the stick in your hand, you almost forget that you're flying a piece of machinery. You're up there with the birds, you know, you are free again. It's such a proud moment to press those buttons for the first time. You know when you're sat in that seat, you're in a Spitfire.
But the first generation of Royce's Merlin engines had a major flaw.
There was a slight problem with it stalling, and obviously that's bad news in an aircraft.
When the plane went into a nosedive, the fuel cut out, and the engine only restarted when the plane was horizontal again.
When they were fighting, that sudden loss of power meant the enemy could get away. And they knew it. So the enemy fighter pilots would roll and then push, and they knew the Spitfire would just disappear in the background.
The solution that saved the day came not from Rolls-Royce, but from a motorbike-loving RAF engineer.
And Miss Tilly Schilling came up with this idea of putting a very small washer-type restriction into the carburetor.
Nicknamed Miss Schilling's orifice, it kept the fuel flowing when the plane went into a nosedive, stopping them from stalling.
One of the great parts about that design was that she was able to retrofit in place, which meant that the engines didn't have to be removed. The RAF could keep their aircraft flying and fighting and defending while she was doing her work on the ground, going around to fit this part herself. It was in her blood, she knew how to do it.
Nearly 80 years later, the Spitfire is still the queen of the skies.
I think the Spitfire to most people is freedom. It's an emblem for a time when the country was really sort of against all odds, about people who were prepared to pay the ultimate price in defense of what they believed in. In that case, it is freedom. So from that perspective, it's very emotional, and that's, I think, why it's meant so much for so many years to so many people.
The Spitfire and the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that powered it was key to the outcome of the war.
I think the Spitfire was integral to us winning the war.
Historians are agree that if it hadn't been for the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the outcome may have been very, very different indeed.
Signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender.
This really saved the Allies in World War II.
The war would have been lost right at the beginning were it not for the Spitfire at that point. I have no doubt.
From that moment on, Rolls-Royce Aero engines became central to the company's success, powering planes that fly to every corner of the globe. But the car business suffered in post-war austerity Britain.
The big luxury motor cars were very consumptive, expensive to maintain, expensive to use. Fuel rationing was still going on, and a car that would only do 12 miles to the gallon wasn't at all popular.
But there were still some people who could afford top-of-the-range rollers. In the 1950s, Rolls-Royce produced a small run of one of the most exclusive cars in the world.
Well, the Phantom 4 was an idea of the Philip, Duke of Edinburgh.
Prince Philip is often spotted behind the wheel of a car. And even by 1948, the young naval officer had developed a love for motoring.
The story goes that the Duke of Edinburgh was visiting a Rolls-Royce factory and was shown a prototype. He said he'd like a go in it, so reluctantly they let him. Apparently he scared everybody stiff, but then got out and said, I want one. That was where the 8-cylinder Phantom 4 came from.
So Rolls-Royce set about making the car, with Prince Philip personally overseeing the construction. Only 18 Phantom 4s were ever produced.
It was exclusive to royalty and the heads of state.
It didn't matter how wealthy one was then. You couldn't buy this unless you fell into that category. Princess Margaret had one, the Queen had two, the Shah of Iran had one, General Franco in Spain had a job lot of 3, one of which is still the state car in Spain today, in which Juan Carlos travels on formal occasions.
It gave them a kind of prestige. You know, if you've got a Rolls-Royce, not only you're rich, but it's important.
Charles Bazley worked at Rolls-Royce, where the Queen's cars were brought in for servicing.
When the Royal cars came in, the first thing that happened was the car, everything that was possible to take off it was taken off and put in a store. All the loose items, so nothing could be taken as souvenirs, that was taken away. And then the car went into the workshop. In those days, the crowds got closer to the cars, and I think some of their clothing scratched the sides of the cars, so they were all repolished or painted, so when they went back out again, they were absolutely perfect.
One of the royal family's Phantom 4s now lives at the Rolls-Royce Enthusiasts Club in Northamptonshire.
This one is one that was built for Her Majesty the Queen and was in the Royal Mews until 12 or 15 years ago. This has been all over the world on the Queen's tours. The interior is upholstered in Bedford cord, and if you look inside, there is a cigarette burn which was allegedly done by Princess Margaret.
And recently, another royal, Meghan Markle, discovered the joy of this stylish car. But whilst the Phantom 4 is still cherished by the royal family, it's not the easiest car to drive.
The very first Phantom 4 is still in use in the Royal Mews. I'm told that the chauffeurs don't like it very much because it's a very big car and doesn't have power steering.
If you didn't run a country but still had a fairly fat wallet, you could empty it by buying a silver Shadow. This is one of the most successful Rolls-Royces ever, but it's one that splits the aficionados.
It was an absolutely superb car. It is certainly the most commercially successful car that Rolls-Royce have ever built.
Rolls-Royce was no longer just for royalty and the aristocracy. A different sort of customer began to emerge.
This was the footballer-type person. That was the image it portrayed, the wide boy that had earned money and, you know, down the market, and he could now have a Rolls-Royce. Whereas before, the lords, the ladies, the gentry of the country, the big directors were taking the money. Now it was becoming normal people. Perhaps that spoilt the name a bit. Don't know.
The orders were stacking up, but the brand image began to suffer.
If you make a brand more accessible and lower its price, it can really devalue the prestige of that brand. And that's what began to happen.
Some people look at that period in time and think, oh, they weren't the Rolls-Royces that they should have been. But, you know, everyone's got a little bit in their history that they, you know, perhaps aren't very proud of, but you need it to evolve.
Rolls-Royce's customers were at odds with the brand ethos. One person in particular took things too far. John Lennon wanted a new paint job for his Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce wanted nothing to do with it. But John Lennon did it anyway, and Rolls-Royce weren't happy. Charles Baisley was working in the factory at the time.
John Lennon's car came into the factory and it went straight out again. Sorry, you're not bringing that in here. It wasn't part of the image, I'm afraid, to have a Rolls-Royce with psychedelic colours painted all over it. It just wasn't cricket. It just wasn't the image they wanted to portray. John Lennon with his psychedelic car and his LSD was not for us, I'm afraid. Off you go, old boy.
It wasn't just Rolls-Royce who were offended. One member of the public took matters into her own hands.
Apparently there was a British woman who saw it, and she was so upset that this great British symbol had been tainted that she expressed that by prodding her umbrella against the paintwork.
But in the late 1960s, the aero engine division had more problems to worry about than paint jobs, and there was real trouble brewing. Their latest jet engine, the RB211, was set to be a game changer in the aero industry, boosting power and slashing fuel consumption. But it was a step too far.
They were building carbon fibre blades, which was fairly innovative. And they were building an engine which had 3 turbines in it. Most of them had 2. So it was a really good engine.
This engine was incredibly advanced for its time and really proved far too costly in development. Sadly, the time came in February 1971. The company was forced into receivership.
Rolls-Royce would survive, although in a different form. And while one division of the old company now flourishes, another faces an uncertain future.
There had been rumours circulating for a couple of days that the cuts were going to come, but it was this morning at 7 o'clock that the workforce got the news that it was fearing.
2018, and Rolls-Royce plc announces a major cost-saving program at its aerospace and defence plants.
Staff at the Sinn Féin Lane site woke to the news today that thousands of them are out of a job. 4,600 jobs are to go worldwide, with 2/3 of those in the UK.
It's a huge blow to Britain's most prestigious brand, but not the first. As the 1970s dawned, the news was even darker. The Rolls-Royce name almost vanished completely. Back then, the aero engines, defence and car businesses were all one. But after management spent a fortune developing a new jet engine, the RB211, the entire company plunged into the red. And on the 4th of February 1971, it collapsed.
The words that really shook the workers came in the Rolls-Royce statement this morning, which said that whatever arrangements may be made to try and save the company, substantial redundancies are inevitable.
Tens of thousands of jobs were on the line.
It's frightening that they might say tomorrow, well, all right, you've been made redundant.
I can remember sort of looking out the window and wondering what was going to happen next.
We'll just have to find another job elsewhere.
Everybody knew somebody. When they eventually went bankrupt and a lot of people lost their jobs, it was quite tough.
But it was too big to fail. The entire business was sold to the British government for £1. The car business and the aero engine business were divided.
We ended up with Rolls-Royce plc, which was the aero engine department, and Rolls-Royce Motor Cars.
Whilst the RB211 project brought about the downfall of the old Rolls-Royce company, the engine itself went on to power a new generation of aircraft, keeping the aerospace business alive. But for the car division, the outlook was bleaker. It ended up being sold to Vickers, best known for making tanks.
The Rolls-Royce title for the product will strictly be for the motor car, and we'll still have the RR on the badge with the mascot on the bonnet.
Over the years, its flame gradually dwindled. And in 1998, the company was on the market again.
Rolls-Royce may no longer have a future as a British-owned company, but German car makers are in a bidding war to get control.
There was a bidding war between Volkswagen and BMW.
BMW was the favourite to buy it. However, Volkswagen outbid BMW at the last minute and secured the deal.
For £430 million, Volkswagen bought the factory, the designs, the grille, and of course the Spirit of Ecstasy herself. But there was one thing missing.
What Volkswagen didn't buy was the rights to use the Rolls-Royce brand name and the Rolls-Royce logo.
The brand name and the logo was owned by Rolls-Royce plc, the makers of the jet engines. As a result, Volkswagen could make the cars, but they couldn't call them Rolls-Royce. Then things got worse.
Quite separately, BMW signed a licensing deal with Rolls-Royce plc and retained the Rolls-Royce mark.
In one of the most audacious corporate coups of all time, BMW managed to lay its hands on the greatest brand in motoring history for a mere £40 million, and immediately set about building a new factory at Goodwood.
BMW did a remarkable job, and they designed a new Rolls-Royce absolutely from scratch. It's sad, in my opinion, that no British company could undertake that investment. And although I think, and myself included, were rather sad to see that the Rolls-Royce name was becoming owned overseas, the story has ended very, very happily.
For some, it was the end of an era. The last major British-owned car maker was now in German hands.
The business will be kept in the UK, keep the Britishness of the product here, ownership from someone else. I think that's the right combination for the business.
The BMW version of Rolls-Royce is not really a Rolls-Royce. I think we know some of the nice parts like the wood and the leather, but the actual engine, chassis and things are all made in Germany, which is a terrible shame. It's not made like we made them.
But for others, it's a return to the glory days of the 30s and 40s, when Rolls-Royce was a brand apart.
Sometimes it takes someone from outside the family to recognise the true virtue of a family. And BMW recognised the real essence of Rolls-Royce, and that is it being classic and timeless. And they navigated its journey from becoming far too accessible to becoming truly exclusive.
Rolls-Royce now has a host of famous owners.
People who buy Rolls-Royces want to be seen or heard. Cars like this are not for shy and retiring types at all.
You know, you look at who owns it, and it's Scepter, it's Abramovitz, 50 Cent.
From models to musicians, Russian oligarchs to rappers, a Rolls-Royce is the only car to be seen in.
You don't smoke a cigarette, you smoke an image. And that's what brands often do. They're a shortcut way of saying, this is who I am. And cars are often purchased, consciously or subconsciously, to say something about oneself. The driver of a Ferrari is saying that they're into power, speed, and passion. With Rolls-Royce, it's really a way of saying, I've made it.
And if you've made it, then this is where your Rolls-Royce will be created.
Hi, welcome to Rolls-Royce Motor Cars. Welcome to the assembly hall. Behind me, on my left-hand side, you will see the production line.
Around 4,000 cars are produced each year. Perfection can't be rushed.
One of the things that you're buying into when you buy a Rolls-Royce is the car's handcrafted, as you can see behind us. There's no robots, there's not automation on our assembly line, and we rely on the skill of our craftsmen and technicians. There's a real personal sense of pride when you see a car completed, when you're building a car, and certainly when you see a car out on the public road, or even better, when we meet one of our customers that comes to the plant and he expresses his excitement and his thrill of owning a Rolls-Royce.
Over 100 years after they first met, the magic of Charles Rolls and Henry Royce lives on.
I went down to Goodwood and picked up the keys to a Rolls-Royce Phantom. And to start with, I looked around the factory and I was just blown away with the passion that everybody has in making that car. And they have immense pride when every car sort of comes off the production line. And stepping into the Phantom, I just felt like I had been elevated into some sort of superstar status. I really felt magical, and I felt like I'd achieved something, even though I'd only driven it for a day and I had to give the keys back at the end of it. I felt very special.
Today, Rolls-Royce cars are more prestigious and exclusive than ever. Whatever the current difficulties the brand faces in the aero engine market, the standalone motor business remains a byword for luxury all over the globe.
You really know that you have an immensely powerful brand when it enters into common language. And Rolls-Royce, yes, it's a vehicle, but it's actually now, it's almost like a kite mark. Anything can be described as the Rolls-Royce of their sector, and that instantly conveys it's the very best, the very finest in its sector.
Engineers work against the clock to keep Paddington Station running 24/7. Jump on board for that, new tomorrow at 9. Back to tonight and throwing new light on a hidden history. We're exploring World War II wrecks in Draining the Ocean, new and next.